It was a quiet afternoon at the local diner, the kind of place where time seemed to slow down. The clink of silverware against plates, the hum of a conversation here and there, and the aroma of coffee filled the air. At a corner booth sat an old man, hunched slightly, his weathered hands wrapped around a mug. His eyes, though aged, had the clarity of someone who had seen more of the world than most. He was 91 years old, but to those who didn't know him, he might have seemed just another frail senior, quietly going about his day. But today, that calm atmosphere was about to shatter. A group of bikers, loud and brash, swaggered into the diner, their leather jackets creaking as they moved. They took no notice of the old man, who remained seated, his hands still clasped around the mug. The biker group, clearly looking for trouble, seemed to take pleasure in their own rowdiness, laughing too loudly and pushing through the narrow aisles with force. It didn't take long before they noticed the old man in the corner. One of them, a tall biker with a black bandana, smirked. "What's this?" "A veteran, huh?" he sneered, looking the man over with disdain. "You lost, old man? This place is for people who know how to live a little." The other bikers laughed, clearly finding amusement in their torment. They leaned in, their presence overwhelming the old man, whose face didn't change. His eyes, though, began to sharpen. There was something in the way he held himself that was different from the average diner customer. But the bikers weren't interested in that. They weren't going to let up. "You deaf, or just too scared to speak up?" one of the bikers taunted, his voice slurring with arrogance. The old man finally lifted his gaze. "You don't want to do this," he said, his voice low and calm, but carrying a weight that made the room seem to grow quieter. The biker scoffed, leaning in closer. "And what's gonna happen if we do?" he asked, his breath reeking of alcohol. "You gonna call your army?" "Oh wait, what are you, 90? Can't even stand up straight, let alone fight back?" The other bikers chuckled again, their jeers filling the space. The old man's expression didn't shift. He took a slow sip of his coffee, his fingers barely trembling. And then, in a move so casual it almost seemed like nothing at all, he reached into his coat pocket. His fingers brushed against something inside it, something that was well worn but always within reach. The bikers didn't see it at first. They were too busy reveling in their false bravado. They weren't paying attention to the man who, despite the years, seemed untouched by their presence. But then the old man pulled out his phone. It wasn't a modern smartphone, just an old, simple device, the kind of phone most people had long discarded in favor of something with more bells and whistles. But to the bikers, the fact that he was calmly holding something at all was strange. "Who you calling, Grandpa?" one of them snorted, stepping forward to loom over the old man. Without saying a word, the veteran brought the phone to his ear, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. The air in the diner shifted, and for the first time, the bikers hesitated. They had been pushing this man for minutes now, but his actions were unnerving. He wasn't reacting the way they expected. The phone clicked, and a deep voice on the other end answered. The old man's words were clipped, precise, and his tone carried an edge that none of the bikers had anticipated. "It's time. They're here." The bikers froze. There was something in his words, something in the calmness of his voice, that made them stop, just for a second. But the silence didn't last long. One of the bikers, not realizing what he had just witnessed, reached out to grab the old man's phone. "Who the hell are you calling?" he demanded, but his voice was no longer as confident. There was a tremor now, an unease that was beginning to spread. The veteran didn't flinch. His grip on the phone tightened, but his eyes never left the biker's face. "You wouldn't want to know," he said, his voice colder than before. The biker reached for it again, but before he could lay a finger on the device, a low rumble echoed from the distance, growing louder by the second. The ground beneath their feet vibrated slightly, the tremors becoming more noticeable. The biker stopped, looking around. The others, too, turned their heads in confusion. The sound seemed to be coming from outside, growing closer, and louder. It wasn't just the engine of a single motorcycle, they could feel it in their bones. Something much bigger was coming. Suddenly, the diner's door flew open with a force that made everyone in the room jump. The sound of powerful engines roared outside. The veteran smiled, not with arrogance, but with the kind of knowing that only comes from experience. He'd made his call, and whatever was about to come next, it was beyond anything the bikers could handle. As the bikers turned their heads to the door, the first sign of something shifting in the room was the sound of boots hitting the floor. The veteran set the phone down on the table, still smiling faintly. The bikers, still reeling from the strange turn of events, realized something: they had just made a mistake they couldn't undo. And they were about to find out just how dangerous it could be to mess with someone who knew exactly what he was doing. The room was about to change. The diner, this quiet little corner of the world, was about to see something that would leave its mark on everyone who witnessed it. The phone call was just the beginning. The air in the diner grew thick with tension as the roar of engines outside continued to shake the building. The bikers, once confident in their intimidation, were now beginning to sense something was very wrong. Their bravado, once a shield, was now crumbling in the face of the unknown. They turned to each other, exchanging nervous glances, unsure of what was happening. The veteran, still seated, maintained his calm. His hands rested on the table, fingers barely touching the surface, but his presence seemed to fill the room. There was something unspoken about him, something in the way he held himself that made even the loudest, most dangerous individuals pause. A biker, the one who had been the loudest, stepped forward, trying to regain his earlier confidence. His voice wavered slightly as he spoke. "What the hell's going on here, old man?" he sneered, his eyes darting around the room. "You calling your pals to scare us off?" The veteran didn't respond immediately. His gaze was still fixed on the door, which was now closed again. The only sound was the muffled rumble of engines outside, still growing louder. It was as if the entire diner was holding its breath, waiting for something that was about to unfold. The biker took another step forward, anger bubbling to the surface. "You think you can just sit there and act like we're afraid of you? I don't care how many people you called in. We're not going anywhere." The veteran's voice broke the silence, low and controlled. "I didn't call anyone, son. I made one phone call, and you'll see soon enough." The biker let out a mocking laugh, but there was an edge of doubt in his eyes. "Yeah? Well, I don't care who you called. You better get ready, old man, 'cause this is about to get real ugly for you." The other bikers, still unsure of what to make of the situation, began to gather closer to their leader. They towered over the veteran, their presence almost suffocating. Their leather jackets creaked as they shifted, their movements slow and deliberate, a show of force they hoped would break the old man's resolve. But the veteran didn't move. His hands remained steady on the table, his posture never faltering. It was clear that this wasn't the first time he'd been in a dangerous situation. His years of experience had taught him how to remain unshaken, even when the world around him seemed to be collapsing. "Listen," the biker said, his voice growing louder as he leaned in, "you've got one last chance. Get up, leave, and don't make me regret this." The veteran's eyes finally met his. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he replied softly, almost with a hint of sadness in his voice. "But you will soon enough." Just then, the sound of the engines outside reached its peak. The ground shook again, this time more violently, and the biker's confidence began to crack. The veteran's words were not those of an old man in fear, they were the words of someone who knew exactly what was about to happen. The diner door creaked open once more. The bikers turned as one, their eyes widening as a new figure stepped into the diner. The man who entered was nothing like the veterans of the past, they weren't even sure what they were seeing. Tall and broad-shouldered, he walked into the diner with a presence that commanded attention. His movements were precise, calculated, and his eyes never left the group of bikers. The veteran didn't stand up, but his expression softened slightly. "It's time," he said quietly. The new arrival's gaze swept across the room, taking in the bikers, the veteran, and the tension that seemed to hang thick in the air. Without a word, he walked toward the counter, completely ignoring the biker's stares. He wasn't fazed. The bikers, on the other hand, were now visibly shaken. This wasn't just some ordinary person. There was something about him, something in his eyes, in the way he moved, that made them realize they were not in control anymore. "Who the hell are you?" one of the bikers finally demanded, stepping forward, trying to regain some of the authority he had lost. The new arrival didn't respond at first. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out something, an object that was unmistakable, though it took a moment for the bikers to understand. It was a military badge, gleaming in the diner's fluorescent light. The biker stepped back, his mouth suddenly dry. The other bikers exchanged looks, their faces pale. "Get out of here," the new arrival said in a voice that was calm, but carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. "Now." The biker leader, still defiant, opened his mouth to respond but stopped himself. There was no fight left in him, not with this man standing in front of him. He could feel the shift in power, and it made his heart race. The bikers hesitated, their minds racing. They had come into the diner with one purpose: to intimidate, to take control. But now, in the face of the veteran's calm resolve and the unexpected ally who had arrived, they were no longer sure of their next move. The silence stretched on, but it wasn't a comfortable silence. It was a silence thick with uncertainty, and it was growing harder and harder for the bikers to ignore. And just as the veteran had predicted, the biker group realized they weren't in control. They were the ones who were about to learn a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. The veteran glanced at the newcomer, his gaze steady. "I think they've had enough," he said. The bikers, looking more unsure with every passing second, finally made their decision. Slowly, one by one, they began to back away, their eyes still locked on the two men standing before them. They knew there was no point in pushing further. The door slammed shut behind them, and just like that, the diner returned to its quiet, peaceful atmosphere. The veteran, his expression unchanged, turned his attention back to his coffee. The situation had been defused, but the lesson had been learned: sometimes, the calmest ones in the room hold the greatest power. The clinking of silverware and the soft murmur of conversations in the diner gradually resumed, though there was a sense of lingering tension in the air. The bikers had gone, but the presence of the man who had stepped in to save the veteran still lingered. The old man didn't say a word as the newcomer stood by the counter, his back to the room, casually sipping from a cup of coffee. It was almost as if nothing had happened, as if the harrowing moments with the bikers were merely a bad memory fading into the past. But the veteran knew better. There was more to this man than just a random savior. The man's posture was relaxed, but there was an underlying strength in his stance, the kind of quiet power that didn't need to be announced. His eyes were a sharp contrast to the chaotic scene that had just unfolded. They held a depth, as though he had seen much more than anyone could imagine. The veteran finally spoke, his voice gravelly yet filled with a certain respect. "You didn't have to do that." The man turned, his lips curling into a slight, almost imperceptible smile. "I know," he said, his voice smooth and confident. "But I don't like bullies, especially when they pick on the wrong people." The veteran nodded, his gaze lingering on the man. There was something familiar in his tone, something that stirred memories from a lifetime ago. It took him a moment, but then it hit him: the man wasn't just some random ally. He was someone the veteran knew from his past, someone who had been part of his own world long ago. "You're from the unit, aren't you?" the veteran asked, his voice softer now. "From back then?" The man's eyes flickered for a moment, a brief flash of something old and far away. "You could say that," he replied, his voice quieter, more distant. "We go way back." "A long way." The veteran's brow furrowed, piecing together the fragments of his memory. "I didn't expect to see you again." "Life has a funny way of bringing people back together," the man said, his expression momentarily softening. He set the coffee cup down on the counter, his gaze now fully focused on the veteran. "But I'm here now, and that's all that matters." For a moment, neither man spoke. The diner, which had been a battleground just minutes earlier, was now peaceful again, as though nothing had ever happened. Yet beneath the surface, the veteran could sense the connection between them, a bond that ran deeper than words could express. It wasn't just about saving the old man from a group of bikers, it was about something more. The veteran could feel it, but he wasn't ready to ask just yet. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his mind drifting back to the past. The war, the battles, the people he had fought with, so many names, so many faces. The unit they had been a part of had been more than just a group of soldiers. They had been brothers, bound by blood and loyalty, facing things no one else could understand. "You still with them?" the veteran asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man's eyes darkened, but he didn't hesitate. "In a way, yes. We don't forget our own." The veteran nodded, accepting the answer without pushing further. They both knew what that meant. There were things that couldn't be said, things that were better left unspoken. The bonds formed in war ran deep, and sometimes they lasted longer than anything else. Just then, a voice interrupted their quiet exchange. A waitress, looking slightly nervous, approached the counter. "Can I get you two anything else?" she asked, her tone polite but unsure. The veteran gave her a small smile. "No, we're good. Thank you." The waitress hesitated, then glanced at the man who had just walked into the diner. "Is everything okay? You, seem to handle those guys pretty easily." The man, still looking calm, nodded. "Everything's fine. They've learned their lesson." The waitress gave him a skeptical look, but then she smiled faintly, deciding it wasn't worth questioning further. "All right, if you're sure," she said, before walking off to tend to another table. The veteran's eyes followed her for a moment, before returning to the man across from him. "I suppose I owe you one," he said, his voice dry but sincere. "But I'm guessing you didn't come all the way here just to handle a few punks in a diner." The man's smile faded slightly, and his gaze grew distant once more. "No," he replied quietly. "I didn't." The silence that followed was heavy. The veteran could tell there was more to the story, something the man wasn't ready to share. But that wasn't his concern right now. He had learned long ago that sometimes, people had their own reasons for doing things, reasons they didn't always want to reveal. "I'm sure you have your reasons," the veteran said, leaning forward slightly, his voice quieter. "But I appreciate what you did. It's been a while since someone had my back." The man nodded, his expression unreadable. "You don't need to thank me. You've done enough. I'm just here to make sure things stay that way." The veteran's gaze sharpened. There was something in the man's words that hinted at a bigger picture, something larger than just this moment. "What's that supposed to mean?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took another sip of his coffee, his eyes scanning the room. "It means you don't know who you've just tangled with," he said quietly, almost as if to himself. "And it's only going to get worse from here." The words hung in the air, unspoken, as the veteran processed them. He knew this wasn't just about a diner confrontation anymore. Whatever had been set in motion today was far from over. And this time, it wasn't just about surviving, it was about something much bigger. The veteran wasn't sure what was coming, but he knew one thing for certain: his life was about to change in ways he couldn't even imagine. But for now, he would have to trust this mysterious ally. He didn't have much choice. The diner, though quiet once more, felt different now, heavier, like the weight of 100 untold stories hung in the air. The veteran sat back in his seat, his mind racing as he processed the man's cryptic words. "It's only going to get worse from here." The words echoed in his ears, stirring memories he'd long tried to bury. The man across from him, who had come to his aid so suddenly, was no stranger. Though their time apart had stretched over decades, the veteran recognized the unspoken bond between them. He knew at the moment the man stepped into the diner. They had served together, side by side, in a unit that had seen far too much in far too little time. War had a way of forging connections, connections that weren't bound by time or distance. Once you'd been in the thick of things, shared the weight of decisions, and lived through the horrors together, those bonds lasted forever. The veteran took a deep breath and stared into his coffee. The steam rose in delicate spirals, but his mind was far from the warmth of the drink. His mind was elsewhere, in the past. The battlefields of another time. The faces of men he had fought beside, men who were more than just comrades, they were family. The unit had been called on missions so dangerous, so secret, that no one would ever know the full extent of what they did. No one would understand. But the man sitting across from him? He had been there. He had seen it all. The veteran's hand tightened around the coffee mug, the familiar weight grounding him. "Do you remember the mission in Faya?" the veteran finally asked, his voice breaking the silence. The man across from him didn't answer immediately. Instead, his eyes seemed to cloud over with memories, as if the mention of that name had pulled him back into another time, a time when life had been much different. Faya, the man's voice was almost a whisper, laced with something the veteran couldn't quite place. How could I forget? It had been a mission unlike any other, dangerous, unrelenting, and with no room for mistakes. The details of the operation were classified, but to the men who had survived it, it was burned into their memories. Faya had been a place of shadows and secrets, and what they had uncovered, there was something they couldn't forget. The veteran closed his eyes for a moment, remembering the weight of their decisions, the impossible choices they had made. "We were lucky to make it out of there alive," he said, his voice barely audible. The man nodded. "Luck had little to do with it," he said quietly. "It was the bonds we forged, the way we worked together. We had each other's backs." The veteran let out a slow, steady breath. "Those were the days, when we were invincible." For a brief moment, the diner seemed to fade away. The veteran was back in that place, back with his comrades. It was as if the years hadn't passed at all. He could still hear the gunfire, still feel the dirt beneath his boots, the heat of the desert sun beating down on him. And most of all, he could still hear the voices of the men he had fought beside. But then, just as quickly as the memories flooded in, they faded again, leaving behind only the quiet hum of the diner. The veteran blinked, his eyes refocusing on the man across from him. "How did we get here?" the veteran asked, almost to himself. "We've spent all these years moving forward, but I never expected it to end like this." The man across from him sighed deeply, his eyes shadowed. "None of us did," he replied. "But here we are. And the past isn't finished with us yet." The veteran's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" The man leaned forward, his voice lowering as though sharing something too dangerous to say out loud. "There are people who never forgot what we did in Faya. People who are still hunting us. Not just me, not just you, but the entire unit." The veteran's heart skipped a beat. "Are you saying?" The man held up a hand, cutting him off. "I'm saying the past has a way of catching up. And it's been a long time coming. The bikers were just the beginning." The veteran sat back in his seat, the words hitting him harder than he had expected. He had thought those days were behind him, tucked away in the corners of his mind, locked away where no one could reach. But now, it seemed like everything he had tried to escape from had found its way back to him. "I never wanted this," the veteran muttered, his voice filled with regret. "I thought it was over, that I was done." The man across from him looked at him with something resembling sympathy, but his eyes also held a hard truth. "You don't get to walk away from your past that easily. None of us do." The silence between them stretched, both men understanding the weight of what was being said. The veteran had lived through countless battles, faced enemies who were far worse than the bikers who had harassed him today. But this? This was different. This was personal. "Do you think they'll come for me?" the veteran asked, the fear creeping into his voice for the first time. The man's expression hardened. "They've already started. And they won't stop until they get what they want." The veteran clenched his fists, his mind racing. He had spent his life fighting for something, whether it was survival, freedom, or honor. But now, it seemed like the ghosts of his past had returned to demand something he wasn't ready to give. The man stood up, his movements slow but deliberate. He placed a hand on the veteran's shoulder. "You're not alone in this. I'm here. We're all still in this together." The veteran nodded, his eyes hardening with resolve. He wasn't going to let the past control him. He had survived the war. He had survived fire. And now, he would survive this. Whatever it took. The diner, once a place of quiet respite, now felt like the calm before a storm. The veteran could feel the weight of the decisions ahead of him, the path he would have to walk once more. The man had come to warn him, but in the process, he had reignited something in the veteran, a spark of determination. The past may have come knocking, but the veteran was ready. Whatever was coming, he was prepared to face it head-on. The next chapter of his life was about to begin. And he wouldn't face it alone. The veteran stood up from the booth, his legs stiff from sitting too long, but his mind was sharp and focused. He looked at the man across from him, who had been more than just a friend, he had been his brother in arms, someone who understood the weight of the past and the choices they had made. The man didn't wait for the veteran to speak. He simply nodded, knowing exactly what was coming. "We don't have time to waste," he said, his voice low and steady. "They'll be here soon. We need to be ready." The veteran gave a brief nod, acknowledging the truth in the man's words. They had been living in the shadows for too long, trying to escape the things they had done. But the shadows weren't big enough to hide them anymore. The enemy was closing in, and this time, there would be no running. As they walked out of the diner, the air outside felt different. The wind had picked up, and the sky was overcast, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The veteran could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just any fight. It was the culmination of years of secrets, of hidden enemies, and of debts owed. The man led the way to a nearby truck, an old, beaten-up vehicle that had clearly seen better days. "Get in," he said, throwing open the door for the veteran. "We're not staying here." The veteran hesitated for a moment, then climbed into the passenger seat. He didn't ask any questions. He had learned long ago that the answers would come when they were needed, not a moment before. As they drove, the silence between them was heavy, but it was the kind of silence that spoke volumes. They had been through too much together, and words weren't necessary anymore. The veteran's mind raced as he thought back to the mission in Faya, to the men they had left behind, and to the enemies who were now hunting them. He knew that whatever happened next, it would change everything. The truck rumbled down the highway, its engine loud in the quiet night. The veteran glanced at the rearview mirror, seeing nothing but darkness behind them. He had spent years trying to outrun his past, but now, it was catching up to him. He could feel it in his bones. Suddenly, the man slammed on the brakes, bringing the truck to a screeching halt. The veteran's hand instinctively shot out to grab the dashboard, but he didn't need to ask why they had stopped. Ahead of them, a group of figures stood in the middle of the road. Their faces were hidden in the shadows, but their presence was unmistakable. The biker gang had returned. The veteran's heart began to pound in his chest. He knew this wasn't just a confrontation over a diner dispute anymore. This was something much bigger. The bikers weren't just troublemakers, they were part of something far more dangerous, something the veteran had feared for years. The man beside him reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a small, well-worn pistol. "Stay calm," he said. "We don't need to make this worse than it already is." The veteran nodded, his hand tightening around the handle of the door. He had never been one to start a fight, but he had never backed down from one either. He had fought in wars, stared down enemies who would have torn him apart without a second thought, and survived. But this time, the stakes were higher than ever before. The truck's engine revved again, and the man drove slowly toward the bikers. As they neared, the leader of the gang stepped forward, a smirk playing on his lips. "You thought you could get away from us, huh?" the biker sneered, his voice low and threatening. "You really think you're untouchable?" The veteran didn't flinch. His eyes locked onto the bikers, steady and unyielding. "I'm not trying to get away from anything," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But you're not going to like what happens next." The biker's smirk faltered, just for a moment. But then, he motioned for the others to move closer, his eyes narrowing in a challenge. You think one old man and his friend can stop us? The veteran didn't answer immediately. He knew that words weren't going to make a difference. He didn't need to prove anything to these men. He simply needed to end this, to make sure they understood that this wasn't a fight they wanted to start. The man beside him, his hand still steady on the wheel, didn't hesitate. He pulled the truck forward, forcing the bikers to step back. Get out of the way, he said, his tone flat and unforgiving. The bikers didn't move, though, their defiance unbroken. It was clear they weren't afraid, not yet. But the veteran could sense something shifting. They were testing him, pushing him to see what he would do. And he was about to show them exactly what he was capable of. Move, the veteran said again, his voice carrying an authority that had nothing to do with his age. You don't want to do this. The leader of the bikers hesitated, his eyes flicking between the veteran and his ally. For a brief moment, doubt flashed across his face. But then, the leader took a step forward, his eyes filled with venom. You think you're the only ones with power? He spat. You're nothing. The veteran didn't flinch. He had heard threats like this 100 times before. But this time it was different. This time, he wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting for something much more personal, for the right to live his life in peace, without fear of the past catching up with him. Without warning, the man beside him stepped out of the truck, moving with a fluidity that belied his age. The biker's eyes widened, unsure of what to make of the sudden movement. But before they could react, the man was standing tall, the pistol now in his hand, aimed toward the ground in a show of strength. You've made your choice, he said coldly. Now it's time to make yours. The veteran stepped out of the truck, his eyes narrowing. The standoff was about to reach its breaking point. One way or another, this confrontation was going to end tonight. And the bikers, for all their bluster, were about to learn just how dangerous the past could be. The cold wind whipped through the air, and the tension between the veteran, his ally, and the bikers reached a boiling point. The veteran could feel the pulse of adrenaline quicken in his chest. This wasn't just another standoff, it was the culmination of a lifetime of decisions, each leading to this moment. His hand rested on the truck's door, his fingers itching for a weapon that wasn't there. But he didn't need one. He had survived much worse than this. The leader of the bikers stepped forward, glaring at the man who had just exited the truck, then shifting his gaze to the veteran. There was a cocky sneer on his face, but there was an edge of uncertainty in his eyes. He could sense that something wasn't quite right. You think you can intimidate us, old man? The leader spat, his voice filled with arrogance, but there was hesitation in his tone. He glanced over his shoulder, signaling his gang to advance. Move, the veteran said, his voice low and calm, as if he were giving an order to someone who had no choice but to follow it. His eyes never left the leader of the group, and the weight of his words seemed to hang in the air, like a silent threat. The bikers, sensing the shift, took a step back, their uncertainty becoming palpable. The leader of the gang paused, considering the old man standing before him. He had expected to see fear in the veteran's eyes, perhaps even hesitation. What he saw instead made him uneasy, a man who had lived through horrors, who had stared death in the face and kept moving forward. Are you really this stupid? The leader spat, taking another step closer. We're not going anywhere, and you're gonna regret thinking you can walk all over us. The veteran didn't answer. Instead, he gave the slightest nod to his ally, a simple gesture, but one that signaled everything. The next moments happened so quickly that the bikers barely had time to react. With one smooth motion, the man with the pistol raised it and fired a single shot into the air. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the quiet night, sharp and deafening, like a thunderclap in the middle of a storm. The bikers froze, their hands instinctively reaching for their own weapons, but it was too late. Before any of them could pull their guns, a low hum began to fill the air, a vibration so deep that it seemed to rattle their bones. The veteran's eyes locked onto the road ahead, his gaze unshaken. He had known this would happen, and now it was unfolding just as he'd predicted. A massive shadow appeared on the horizon, growing larger by the second. The biker leader's eyes widened as he turned to see what was coming toward them. What he saw was something no one could have expected, a fleet of vehicles, but not just any vehicles. These were military-grade trucks, armored and bearing insignias that sent a chill down his spine. The bikers, their bravado now stripped away, began to retreat. The veteran didn't need to lift a finger. The sight of the incoming convoy was enough to send them scattering. The leader tried to gather his group, but his words faltered as the vehicles neared. "You were saying something about intimidation," the veteran asked quietly, his eyes still fixed on the leader of the gang. The bikers turned and ran, no longer interested in confrontation. The veteran had known that this would happen. This wasn't just a matter of surviving one night in a diner or standing up to a few thugs. It was about something much bigger, something the bikers weren't prepared for. The convoy of trucks stopped a few yards away, their engines still idling as they powered down. The headlights illuminated the dark road, casting long shadows that made the bikers look like nothing more than ants scurrying away from an oncoming storm. The veteran's ally, still holding the pistol, relaxed his grip and turned toward the convoy. A tall man, dressed in tactical gear, stepped out of one of the trucks. His face was obscured by a helmet, but his presence was enough to signal that he wasn't someone to be taken lightly. The veteran nodded to him as if greeting an old friend. "Get in," the man said, his voice gruff but filled with authority. The veteran didn't hesitate. Without a word, he climbed into one of the trucks, followed by his ally. The convoy was here now, and there was no going back. The bikers had learned what it meant to cross paths with someone who had lived a different life, one they couldn't even begin to understand. As the trucks pulled away from the scene, the veteran looked out the rearview mirror, watching the diner slowly fade into the distance. This was only the beginning. Whatever had been set in motion tonight was part of a much larger plan, one that he wasn't sure he was ready for. His ally turned to him as the truck sped down the dark road, their engines purring like a well-oiled machine. "You knew this was coming," he said, his tone a mixture of respect and disbelief. The veteran nodded slowly, the weight of the moment sinking in. "I've been waiting for it, for a long time now." They both knew the real fight was just beginning. The bikers had been just a small part of something much bigger, something dangerous, something they had no choice but to face head-on. And this time, the stakes were higher than ever before. The convoy continued down the road, its headlights piercing the darkness, heading into the unknown. The veteran sat back in his seat, the gravity of what lay ahead pressing heavily on his shoulders. He had been through worse. He had fought wars, faced enemies that should have killed him, and survived when he shouldn't have. But this? This was different. This was personal. The convoy rumbled on, cutting through the night, as the veteran and his ally prepared for whatever came next. They didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain, they weren't going to run anymore. They were going to fight. And they would win, or die trying. The convoy moved through the night, its steady hum a constant reminder that they were far from done. The veteran sat in the back of the truck, his thoughts racing. The faint glow from the truck's dashboard illuminated his weathered face, but his eyes were focused far beyond it. The landscape outside was dark, barren stretches of road with nothing but the occasional flash of trees and distant hills passing by. His mind wasn't on the quiet surroundings, though. It was on the decision that loomed over him. The past had returned, and the fight was only just beginning. He glanced over at his ally, who was sitting beside him, his posture stiff and alert. There was a weight in the air between them, one that hadn't been present before. They had both seen war, fought in it, lived through it. But this was different. The mission they were on now wasn't about survival. It was about something bigger than either of them. The convoy turned a sharp corner, and the veteran looked out the window again, his face hardening. He wasn't sure what the next move would be, but he knew it wasn't going to be easy. He had lived his life always thinking one step ahead, calculating risks, and making decisions with the lives of others in mind. But now, with the threat of his past closing in on him, the stakes were higher than they had ever been. "Do you think we can stop them?" The veteran's voice cut through the silence, low and serious. His ally didn't answer right away. Instead, he seemed to weigh the question, his eyes searching the darkened road ahead as if the answer was written somewhere out there. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady but edged with an unspoken truth. "Stopping them won't be easy. These are people with power, connections, resources. They've been hunting us for a long time. And they're not just going to back off." The veteran absorbed the words quietly, the weight of them sinking in. He had known it wouldn't be simple. Nothing ever was. But there was a part of him, small but insistent, that still wondered if it was possible to walk away from this. After all, he had done it once before, hadn't he? "Maybe it's better to just walk away," the veteran murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "Let them have what they want. We've fought long enough." His ally turned to him, his eyes hard. "And let them win? Let them control us for the rest of our lives? You know what's at stake here. These people aren't just after us. They're after everyone who fought in that war. Everyone who knows what happened in Faya. If we back down now, they'll come after our families. Our friends. Everyone who's ever crossed their path." The veteran clenched his fists, feeling the anger rise in his chest. He had thought about running, about leaving it all behind, but his ally's words rang true. It wasn't just about them anymore, it was about protecting the people they loved. It was about stopping a dangerous force from continuing to manipulate and control. "We can't let that happen," the veteran said, his voice growing firmer. "We've already lost too much." His ally gave him a slight nod, and for a moment they sat in silence, the decision settling between them like an unspoken pact. The veteran had always known that his life was filled with difficult choices, but this one felt different. He wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. This was a fight for justice, for redemption. "We're going to stop them," the veteran said finally, the determination clear in his voice. "Whatever it takes." The convoy continued down the road, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The veteran's mind raced with plans, with ideas on how to outsmart the enemy. But there was one thing he knew for sure, they couldn't do this alone. This would require allies, old friends, perhaps, or people they had never met but who shared the same cause. They couldn't take on this shadowy force by themselves. "I know a few people who owe me favors," the veteran said, breaking the silence once again. "We'll need their help." His ally raised an eyebrow, but a smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "You always did know how to make friends in high places." The veteran smiled faintly. "You make enough enemies, you learn to find a way out of trouble. Besides, we won't get anywhere without the right support." The convoy turned another corner, and the lights of a small outpost began to appear on the horizon. The veteran's heart raced. This was it, the point of no return. "Stay sharp," the ally said, his eyes narrowing. "We're close to their territory now. I can feel it." The veteran nodded, his mind already shifting gears. They were close, closer than ever before. The next few hours would determine everything. There would be no turning back once they crossed this line. "We do this right," the veteran said, his voice cold with resolve, "and we end this for good." As the convoy neared the outpost, the veteran couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into the heart of the storm. He had faced battles before, but this was different. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a fight for everything he had fought for in the past, for the life he had built since the war, and for the future of those who came after. The decision had been made. Now, it was time to face the consequences. And no matter what happened, the veteran knew one thing for sure, he wouldn't face it alone. The convoy slowed as it neared the outpost, the headlights cutting through the night, illuminating a series of tightly packed buildings and armed guards stationed at various points. The place looked abandoned at first glance, but the veteran knew better. This was no ordinary outpost. It was a hub for operations, a place where enemies like the ones they were chasing pulled the strings from the shadows. The trucks rolled to a stop, the sound of their engines reverberating through the silent air. The veteran's ally was already on edge, his eyes scanning the area as he slowly stepped out of the truck, checking for any sign of movement. The veteran followed suit, his boots crunching on the gravel beneath him. The cool night air bit at his skin, but he barely noticed. His focus was entirely on the task at hand. "I'll cover the perimeter," the ally said, his voice low and controlled. "You head for the main building. I'll signal you when it's clear." The veteran nodded, his gaze never wavering from the complex ahead. He could feel the weight of every decision that had brought them here, every step that had led him to this moment. They had chosen to stand their ground, to fight back against the people who had once controlled their lives from the shadows. Now, they had to finish it. With a final glance at his ally, the veteran made his way toward the main building, his steps measured but purposeful. He wasn't sure what he was walking into, but he was ready for whatever came next. The enemy they were up against was powerful, ruthless, and had a long reach. But he knew that the strength of their resolve, the bonds they shared, was more than enough to face whatever lay ahead. As he approached the entrance, the veteran's hand went instinctively to the old military knife strapped to his side, a tool he had carried with him for years. It was a reminder of who he was, of the man who had fought and survived. He reached the door, his pulse steady, and pushed it open. Inside, the dim light revealed a series of narrow hallways, with doors leading into rooms that were, for now, shrouded in mystery. The veteran's eyes narrowed as he moved through the space. Every instinct screamed that something was wrong, but he couldn't quite place it. Suddenly, a voice broke through the silence. "You really think you can just waltz in here like this?" The voice was smooth, yet edged with a venomous calm. The veteran froze, his senses immediately on alert. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The voice, the tone, he recognized it instantly. The veteran didn't respond at first, waiting for the figure to make its move. He had come prepared for this confrontation, but he had not expected it to come so soon. The man stepped out of the shadows, his presence as imposing as ever. Dressed in dark clothing and carrying the air of someone who had controlled things from the back seat for far too long, the man's smile was cold, calculated. "Ah, I see you remember me," the man said, his smile widening. "I must admit, I didn't expect you to come this far. But it doesn't matter now. You should have stayed in your little diner and left things alone. Now, look at you, walking straight into my trap." The veteran's grip on his knife tightened, his body instinctively going into a defensive posture. This wasn't just a random threat. This was personal. This man had been the architect of everything, the shadows they had lived under, the consequences they had faced. "I didn't come for a fight," the veteran said, his voice calm but edged with a warning. "But I'm not going to back down, either." The man laughed, the sound echoing in the empty hallway. "Back down? You don't have a choice. You never did." He gestured to the armed guards emerging from the shadows, weapons drawn. "You think you can just walk in here and disrupt everything I built?" For a moment, the veteran said nothing. His mind worked quickly, calculating his next move. This wasn't a simple confrontation. This man had people, resources, and a network of influence. But the veteran had lived through far worse. He had learned the hard way that no matter how powerful someone appeared, there was always a way through, always a weakness to exploit. "You're right," the veteran said quietly, his voice laced with certainty. "I didn't come here to disrupt everything. I came to end it." The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, there was silence. The guards surrounding him didn't move, their eyes locked on the veteran, but it was clear they were uncertain. The man had expected to see fear in the veteran's eyes, but instead, he saw something far more dangerous, a determination that couldn't be swayed. Without warning, the veteran lunged forward, his movements quick and precise. The knife flashed in his hand, a blur of steel that cut through the air. The guards, caught off guard by the speed and accuracy of the veteran's strike, hesitated for just a moment too long. In that moment of hesitation, the veteran made his move. With a swift, calculated motion, he disarmed the first guard, sending him crashing to the ground with a well-placed strike. He moved to the next, using his years of experience to outmaneuver them, knocking another guard aside with a powerful kick. The man's smile faded, replaced by a look of surprise and anger. "You really thought you could take me down with these tactics," he spat, his voice growing darker. The veteran didn't answer. He was too focused, too determined to let his emotions interfere. The battle wasn't over yet, and the final confrontation was still ahead. The guards continued to advance, but with each move the veteran made, they were forced to retreat. His actions were methodical, each step bringing him closer to his goal. Finally, the man stepped back, his eyes flashing with fury. "Enough," he said, his voice cold and final. "I underestimated you, old man. But this ends now." But the veteran knew this wasn't over. It wasn't just about defeating the man, it was about ending the cycle, taking back control. He wasn't going to let this enemy, or any enemy, define him anymore. As the veteran advanced, he realized this moment wasn't just about survival. It was about reclaiming the power that had been taken from him all those years ago, about showing that the past didn't have to control the future. The resolution was clear: no matter what it took, this fight would end on his terms. The sound of the veteran's footsteps echoed down the narrow hall, growing louder with each step. The man in front of him, still fuming with rage, raised his hands in a final attempt to summon the last of his power. The veteran didn't need to look at him to know what was coming next. He could feel the shift in the air, the tightening of the tension that had been building throughout the confrontation. The man's hands trembled as he reached for a concealed weapon, his face twisted in frustration. But the veteran, already anticipating the move, was faster. In a single, fluid motion, he ducked under the man's outstretched arm, spinning around and slamming him against the cold concrete wall. "You're not the first person to underestimate me," the veteran said quietly, his voice carrying a finality that matched the exhaustion in his bones. The man gasped for breath, his face pale and sweating, and for the first time, the veteran saw genuine fear flicker across his eyes. It wasn't fear of physical harm, this man was used to violence. No, it was fear of something much deeper. The fear of losing control, of losing everything he had built through manipulation and fear. "You never understood the meaning of strength," the veteran said, leaning in close so the man could hear him clearly. "You thought it was all about power, about control. But real strength is knowing when to let go, when to stop trying to force things." The man's eyes narrowed, but he didn't speak. He couldn't. His body was shaking now, not from injury but from the realization that his time had run out. He had played this game for so long, always thinking he could outsmart everyone, that he never considered the possibility that someone would stand up to him with something more than brute force, something far stronger. "You think you've won?" the man sneered, his voice weak but defiant. "This is just one battle. There are others waiting." The veteran straightened up, his eyes hardening. "Maybe," he said, his voice low and steady. "But this is where it ends for me. This is where I choose my own path. I don't live for the past anymore, and I won't let it control my future." The man struggled for breath, but no words came. The veteran stood, letting the silence between them speak volumes. He had fought many battles, both on and off the field. But this one felt different. It wasn't about survival. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about reclaiming his life, taking back control over something that had been stolen from him long ago. The sound of approaching footsteps reached their ears, and the veteran knew the job wasn't completely done. There would be cleanup, there would be consequences. But in that moment, he felt a sense of closure, a deep, unshakable peace. He had faced his past, stood up to it, and proved that no matter how deep the shadows ran, he would not be controlled by them. "I could kill you right now," the veteran said softly, "but that wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't make me any better than you." The man's defiance melted away, replaced by something close to understanding. He wasn't expecting mercy. But he was starting to realize that mercy wasn't weakness, it was strength. The veteran had broken free of the cycle. "I don't need to finish this with violence," the veteran continued, looking down at the man. "I'll let you go. You'll walk away from this, but I won't let you do it again." The veteran turned away, walking toward the door where his ally was waiting. The decision was made. The fight had been won, but it wasn't won through brute force or violence, it was won by knowing when to let go, when to step away, and how to walk away with your dignity intact. As the convoy pulled away from the outpost, the veteran sat back in the truck, looking out at the horizon. There was a sense of calm now, one that had eluded him for so long. He had spent his life running, fighting, surviving, but now, he had learned the most important lesson of all: sometimes, the hardest fight is the one you don't fight. He had chosen to break free from the grip of his past. He had chosen to stop living in fear, to stop living under the shadow of what had come before. And in that moment, as the truck rumbled down the road, the veteran knew that he had found something far more valuable than any victory he had ever won. He had found peace. And with that peace, the veteran understood that sometimes, the greatest strength doesn't come from the battles you win, but from the ones you choose to walk away from. The past no longer had control over him. He had taken back the one thing that was truly his future.